listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. Radio's authority on the world of the paranormal and the science of parapsychology, celebrating 25 years of broadcasting. Broadcasting around the world and to the great beyond.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X-Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the X-Zone. I am Rob McConnell. We're coming to you live and around the world from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And you can listen to the X-Zone 724, 365 at www.xzoneradiotv.com. This has been one heck of a day in the news. We have demonstrations and protests going on in the city of Chicago right now. We have the Turkish Air Force that shot down a Russian aircraft. We still have the quest and the hunt for a couple of terrorist suspects. The terror alert is heightened in the United States because of the holiday weekend. And by the way, to each and every one of our listeners throughout the great United States, very happy Thanksgiving. And please, please be safe and sound. So there's no one else that I know who can try and make some sense of this insane world. None other than my good friend Howard Bloom, who is the author of The Mohammed Code. And it's available at www.amazon.com. And for more information on Howard, his website is www.howardbloom.net. And Howard, my friend, how are you tonight? Howard, are you there?
Rob, I would be well if I understood. You can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello?
Yes, Howard, I'm here.
Hello? Oh, great. Okay, terrific. Terrific. Okay. It would be a good night. It would be a pre-holiday night if it were not for the fact that on October 11th, on my YouTube series, I issued a warning saying that there was a trigger for World War III, and his name is Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He's the president of Turkey. And as soon as the Russians began to move into Syria, he made it very clear that even though he had been cozying up to the Russians in order to basically give the finger to the West, now he was suddenly running back to his Western allies, and he was saying that if there were any incursions of his border by the Russians, that he would resort to NATO's support, the support of 27 countries. Rob, there's a recipe for a world war. We learned it from World War I. When you have two alliances lined up against each other, and those the alliances are triggered, then you have a domino effect. Instead of just two countries duking it out, instead of just Turkey and Russia duking it out, you have Turkey and all of the 27 countries of NATO duking it out against Russia, which has more nuclear weapons than any other nation on the face of planet Earth, including the U.S., and Russia's alliance, which includes Iran, which includes Syria, which includes China, if the Russians can manage to get the Chinese in on this. So we have the raw ingredients here for World War II. Putin has gathered his leadership, and he's been consulting with them today about what measures to take against Turkey, and he has announced that those measures will be serious. Well, Putin is not the kind of a guy who solves things diplomatically. He solves things militarily. He prides himself on being a tough guy. He's little, but he likes martial arts maneuvers, and he likes to make military moves in places like the Ukraine or places like Syria. So there's a very strong possibility that his response, his serious repercussions, will be military. And if that's the case, the West will be called on, I mean NATO, all of its 27 countries will be called on to respond in kind. And that's how world wars start. We do not want a world war. There's an additional complication here for Barack Obama. Barack Obama has backed down on so many things that Putin has taken his measure and realized that Barack Obama's a cream puff. And But Barack Obama has to, as a matter of necessity, try to solve this diplomatically, because the options, the military options, are nightmarish. They are horrible. But by trying to solve this problem militarily, Barack Obama will reinforce the notion that he is weak and can be pushed around. Nonetheless, he has to try to solve this problem diplomatically, no matter what the repercussions are for him, because the alternative, war, is inconceivable.
Howard,
unfortunately, it really is conceivable, but it's a nightmare.
Howard, is it possible that the president of France, Mr. Hollande, could actually be the negotiator between the United States and Russia to bring them together in order to
yes.
annihilate
yes.
ISIS?
I think I've mentioned this. I think I've mentioned to you, what's your audience before, that 2 years ago, well, first of all, about 4 years ago, the Office of the Secretary of Defense threw a forum based on my second book, Global Brain, and brought in people from the State Department, the Energy Department, DARPA, IBM, and MIT. And 2 years ago, something occurred to me. Our enemy in Syria is not Bashar Assad. Our enemy in Syria is ISIS. And Bashar Assad, in fact, is our greatest ally in the battle against ISIS, because he's capable of fighting ISIS in ways that nobody else can. And there's something else that we've mentioned on this program, the lesson of the dictators. We learned a lesson from the Arab Spring. We thought that when you toppled the dictators, the people would rush in and establish constitutional democracies, secular democracies like the one that we have. Well, that was an illusion. And every time we toppled the dictator, we left a vacuum open for people like ISIS. So if Bashar Assad were toppled, we would leave the kind of vacuum that ISIS really revels in, that ISIS thrives in. So we needed Bashar Assad in order to stop ISIS. That was the message I was giving to the White House. And the message, in addition, that I was giving to the White House was, if you step into this now and create a coalition against ISIS, that coalition can include Russia, because it has serious problems on its southern borders with Muslim militancy, Dagestan, Uzbekistan, all of the stans down there, Chechnya,
right.
All of them have their formerly Muslim territories, and they could go to ISIS in a snap. And China has a serious Muslim problem because its far western province, this province, is a Muslim territory, and China is very aware of that.
Howard,
and there have been terrorist incidents in that territory. ISIS is probably having an influence there. So we could get together, China, Russia, and unfortunately Iran, and lead the world in a charge against ISIS. Well, that was an opportunity for leadership 2 years ago. But that opportunity for leadership doesn't exist anymore because another person realized that it was an opportunity. His name is Vladimir Putin, and he stepped into it. And now a second person has realized that it's an opportunity for leadership, and that's Francois Hollande, thanks to the incidents in Paris. And Francois Hollande is doing his best to put together the kind of coalition we should have put together 2 years ago. But we missed the chance. Nonetheless, that coalition has to exist. So yes, if there is a hope for getting the United States together with Russia, it's Francois Hollande. The big problem is we are heavily committed, for reasons that are utterly beyond me, to topple Bashar Assad. We want to topple Bashar Assad because we want to satisfy two allies. Turkey, which is intent on toppling Bashar Assad, Assad. But neither Saudi Arabia nor Turkey seem to have a plan of what will happen once Bashar Assad is gone.
Howard,
and what will happen is ISIS.
Howard, my producer wants me to disconnect and reconnect because we're getting a chattering effect here. So we're going to disconnect. Craig's going to reconnect, and we'll get you right back.
Okay.
All right. Exonation, Howard Bloom is my guest this hour. We apologize for the quality of the feed. We are just going to reestablish that feed right now. Howard Bloom's website is www.howardbloom.net, and Howard is the author of The Muhammad Code. And I've said this many times. To me, the Muhammad Code is the Rosetta Stone of what is happening within the Middle East. And Howard, welcome back.
Thanks, Rob. So how's our sound this time?
Still a little choppy. Howard, are you there?
Yeah, it is clippy.
Yeah, it is.
It's doing some clipping. Do you want? Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
So it's clipping a lot. Okay, call me back, okay?
All right, we're going to do that right now, Howard. Once again, Exo Nation, we apologize for the inconvenience, but we're going to get Howard right back here. This is what happens sometimes. And you know what? Like I keep saying, technology is great. as long as it works. And there are times it works, and there's times when it doesn't work. 1-800-610-7035 worldwide toll-free is my toll-free number. X-Zone at xzoneradiotv.com is our email address. And, of course, we can always be heard 724-365 at www.xzoneradiotv.com. Howard Bloom is our guest, and his website is www. You're going to try this again? www.howardbloom.net. All right, Howard, do we have you back here, my friend?
I'm still here.
Okay,
your voice is clipping, but we can live with it.
Right.
How's mine?
Yours is fine. It seems that the internet doesn't want the truth out there.
Oh, God, what a mess. Now, okay, so this is the situation in Turkey. The situation in Turkey and Syria is dangerous and could lead to the next world war. Why is there a dangerous situation in Turkey? If we put this into the broadest historical context, I mean the really broadest historical context, humans did not invent war. The very first creatures on the face of the earth, our foremothers, bacteria, who gave us everything that a lot of what we have today. Those bacteria gathered in groups of 7 trillion. That's groups of more individuals than all the humans who've ever lived in history. And those groups of 7 trillion made war against each other. So war is not just one of the first inventions of life. Back only about 400,000 years after the Big Bang, clumps of matter started competing, and the clumps that won swallowed clumps that lost whole. So competition to the death, violent competition, has been built into this cosmos from the very beginning. And why is that relevant? Because what are we seeing in Chicago? People are very disturbed, and according to what you said a few minutes ago, there have been protests in the streets because of the release of a video in which a policeman, I haven't seen the video yet because I've been focusing on Turkey and Syria, but it looks as if a policeman is shooting an unarmed 17-year-old teenager for absolutely no reason.
Well, for one
and the black community is understandably upset about this.
Well,
all of these conflicts, black versus white, Shiites versus Sunnis, Muslims versus Westerners, they're all built into our biology by nature, and it's our job to overcome them to the best of our ability.
Well, for one thing, Howard,
one of the ways we
Howard,
overcome them is through diplomacy instead of war, and through demonstrations instead of riots.
Well, for one thing, Howard, the young black person was armed with a knife. Howard, are you there? Oh, it seems that we lost Howard again.
Aha.
Yeah, no, Howard.
That's interesting.
Yeah, no, he was armed
Have
with...
you seen the video yet, Rob? Tell me what you think is happening in Chicago. I followed it. Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Howard, what we're going to do is we're going to take a commercial.
No, I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm here.
I know you're there, but it's very hard because...
Let me call you.
No.
I call you.
No, Howard, I sent you an IM message.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, let's hang up and let me call you.
No, Howard. No, you don't call because the board's closed. All right, I guess he's going to try and call. This ought to be good. Do. So while we're waiting for Howard to call because he couldn't hear what I was saying, what's he doing here? Let's see what he's going to do, Craig. Craig's waiting. And let me see. Isn't technology great, Craig? Yeah, Skype went downhill as soon as Microsoft got its hands on it. Does that make, leave it to Microsoft to screw things up. All right, here we go. Someone... Let's see if this works. All right. One ringy dingy.
Yes.
Oh, there there you
Houston,
are.
we have contact. Right.
That's what she said.
Yes. This is a big improvement.
Yeah, no, Howard,
So,
I did see that video, and what it shows is from the time of the police contact, they show the the suspect being shot by the police officer. There's no two ways about that. From what I saw, there was no imminent danger to the police officer's life whatsoever. However, what it doesn't do is show you what brought the police to this action.
Right. And what did bring the police to this action?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I really don't know. And my question is, Howard, if it would have been a black officer shooting a white kid, would there be protesting in the streets of Chicago tonight?
I think that would inflame people. Whether there would be protests, it's very hard to say. But remember, Rob, compare protests to the kinds of things that used to happen in the 1800s. In the 1800s, there were riots in which 30 or 40 people were killed.
Yeah.
And in the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been very little violence. Yes, there's been looting on the sidelines, but that's not looting created by the protesters themselves. And we are fortunate to have a protest industry. We're fortunate to have a valve of expression that doesn't involve violence.
But what about that cop, that policeman in Texas who was shot 18 times while filling up his cruiser by a black person?
And what about Michael Brown? I mean, Michael Brown has been lionized. Michael Brown's death is the death around which the Black Lives Matter movement was organized more than any other. And Michael Brown was a thug, a monster, and his very body was a lethal instrument. And if you saw the tapes of him in the store where he was ripping off some cigarillos or cigars, you saw that when the owners tried to approach him before he could get out the door, the owners were half his size, and he charged them like a mad bull. And he looked threatening as all hell. And that's ignored in these protests. So one way or the other, we're getting to a point where we're not killing 30 or 40 people the way that the Oklahoma riots in the 1800s killed tons of people, the way that many other riots in the 1800s killed a lot of people. I'm glad that people are saying Black Lives Matter. Black lives do matter.
Well, so do white lives. So do the police lives matter.
Yeah,
come on, I think that what's going on is that certain elements within the black community are still carrying a grudge, and they love it when this happens because they can get on their soapboxes and they can make all these social cases about the injustices, this, that, and the other thing. Well, you know what? Cause and effect. That's what it works out to. If you break the law, there's an effect. And it seems that, society is saying, well, geez, you know what? Maybe we haven't been as fair. Maybe this, maybe that. I think it's a crock. I think that, I don't care what color you are, where you're from, you break the law, there's consequences. So this
but we've seen people like the guy who was killed getting out of his Mercedes, of all things, and running away, wasn't really, he was being stopped for having a taillight out. You don't kill people for having a taillight out, for God's sake.
All right, and you don't get out of your car and start running if that's the only thing that you're guilty of either.
That's true. He should have stayed in his car and stayed calm, but then there was Sandra, whatever her name was, down in Texas, and she stayed in her car, and the policeman didn't like the way she was behaving herself in his car, and ultimately ended up in an incident where she ended up hanging in a jail cell and is now dead. There's no question, Rob, that black people are treated differently than white people. There's no question, because I've spent time with the police, there's no question that there's a degree of arrogance in the police force and a degree of feeling above the law that is sometimes really appalling. There's no question that needs to be balanced. People are talking about the Ferguson effect and saying that our crime rates are going up because policemen have been inhibited. Well, in certain ways, they should be inhibited. When I meet with my friend Darwin Johnson, who's a computer scientist, and his father was a computer scientist, and I realize that when he leaves wherever it is that I'm meeting with him, he could be slapped up against a car and treated in ways that are really horrible. That's just not right. So we need to balance these things, and we need to do it by peaceful means. And there's a basic fact about Western civilization. There are a bunch of basic facts, but one of them is this, that the rate of peace in Western civilization has increased since 1650 by a factor of 10. In other words, in modern Western society, you are 1/10 as likely to die a violent death at the hands of a human being as you were in 1650. The person who has written this up, Steven Pinker, and he seems to have gotten the idea from one of my books, The Lucifer Principle, where it's covered in a page and a half, but Steven does it in 650 brilliant pages in his book, The Better Angel of Lower Nature, and Steven Pinker calls this the humanist revolution. Well, I don't care what it is, whatever it is, we're on the right path. And allowing people peaceful ways to vent their feelings, even if I disagree with them, and sometimes I do tremendously, is a positive thing. Today, I do my work at cafes.
Yeah.
I do all my writing and all my research. As long as you have a laptop in your lap, you can do anything you want. And there was a woman sitting next to me, and I became curious about what she does. She's a social activist who came out of the what was it called? The protesting on Wall Street movement. The big protest that we had on Wall Street. I'm forgetting the name. The movement against the 1% having most of the wealth. And her friends are anarchists. Well, there's no way in hell I ever want to see anarchism applied in the United States of America. It leads to chaos.
Yeah.
It doesn't lead to a better society. But there's a privilege to being able to sit next to somebody with whom you disagree and talk with them and find out what they have to say without you killing each other, without you hurting each other. And that's the direction in which we're moving. So we have to be careful to allow legitimate protest, which is written into the American Constitution, and to in every single way possible curb the kind of mayhem and violence that we saw when kids were taking advantage of the Ferguson protests to loot local stores. I mean, when I marched in Washington, D.C. against the Vietnam War in the 1960s, the mid-1960s, there were kids on the sidelines, but we were hundreds of thousands of us. And there were kids on the sidelines who were monsters, and they were breaking store windows. And I loathed what they were doing because they were radically misrepresenting the rest of us who were down there. Well, it's time. We need to put a stop to the people looting. But we also have to recognize that the kind of dialogue that demonstration produces in the United States is unique, that the equivalent to this form of dialogue in Syria right now is civil war. People's homes, they are sitting in their homes, eating their evening meal, and whammo, their home is destroyed. Their children are killed. Their body parts can't even be found. Their wives are killed, and they're lucky to get out. They're lucky, but how horrible. We're accustomed to being able to walk home to our neighborhood every night and see our house intact. They are not. And they somehow have to get on the track of civilization, Western civilization, I believe, that tends to lead to this vast increase in the amount of peace. Unfortunately, we have two allies. One is in Syria, one is Turkey, and the other is Saudi Arabia. And the Syrian civil war, we have talked about this, you and I, many times. It is not a civil war. Anybody who says that is lying to you. It is a proxy war. It is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, in which the Iranians and the Saudis are cynically using the Syrian people as cannon fodder, and that's not right. Do we have conscious, rational ways of dealing with this? Well, we can try diplomacy, but if what Barack Obama and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and the new king of Saudi Arabia, if they are absolutely insisting that Bashar Assad must go, they're going to get it wrong, Rob. As horrible as Bashar Assad is, they are on the wrong side in this conflict. And one diplomat speaking on, I think it was Al Jazeera television last night, said, well, if you take up the case of supporting Bashar Assad, then Saudi Arabia and Turkey are going to be angry with you. It's time to sit down with those guys and tell them you're going to have to swallow something you do not like, or you're going to end up with a chaos that kills you, because ISIS wants to lop off the head of the king of Saudi Arabia and the heads of all of the members of the royal family. That's what they want to do. They would like to do the same to Tayyip Recep Erdogan,
all right, so let me ask you this. What would happen if all the coalition countries, the United States, France, Russia, Britain, said, you know what? Iran and Saudi Arabia, this is your problem. We're out of here.
Well, the big difficulty with that is that ISIS has global ambitions, and you saw that in Paris.
Yeah.
And you will see that someday if they succeed in the United States.
Which I think they will.
See that in the United
Which
States.
I think they're going to.
Rob, I record a podcast, a professionally done podcast, every Monday in an office in a studio on 50th Street and 7th Avenue.
Yeah.
That's the top of Times Square.
Okay.
And I walk through Times Square every Monday, just taking in the awe, the marvel of it. But I'm very aware of the fact that this is a primary target for ISIS. And one of these days, if we don't stop ISIS, ISIS or a group like it is going to get its hands on a nuclear weapon. That's a real problem for us, because the Islamic world has had its Islamic bomb since 1998, when Pakistan exploded its first nuclear device, tested its first nuclear device. And Pakistan's been building a nuclear arsenal ever since then. And today, I believe it was, a secular blogger was stabbed to death, hacked to death in the streets of Pakistan for being secular. And he's one of several who have endured this fate. What does that tell you about the folks in whose hands these nuclear weapons, probably over 100 of them, lie? Not something reassuring at all.
They're total idiots. They're total idiots.
Well, but ISIS would like to take over in Pakistan, and they've been working on it for 6 months. We first talked about ISIS inroads into Pakistan and Afghanistan 6 months ago. Now suddenly in this very week, the press has been waking up to the activities of ISIS in Afghanistan. You and I discussed it on the X Zone radio.
Yes, we did.
6 months ago. So if you and I can figure these things out in advance, then surely people in the State Department who specialize in these things and the CIA should be able to figure it out. And now that doesn't mean we know what to do about it, but the first step is understanding.
You know,
one of the great...
You know,
Go
Howard,
ahead.
I don't think that the next terror attack is going to be in New York City, because everyone within the intelligence community, within law enforcement, is focusing on New York. It's going to be a target that is totally not being watched by the security people and and law enforcement. It's going to be a bad one, but it's not going to be New York City, because that's where all the anticipation is.
But you could be right, but when you're walking in a throng of people, there are probably, when I walk through Times Square, 30,000 to 40,000 people walking through that 9-block area. And anybody could be wearing an explosive vest. Absolutely anybody. And there's no way the police would know.
No.
And there aren't... I saw a throng, a group of 4 policemen, but I did not see them in Times Square. I saw them out here in Park Slope, my neighborhood, way out in the boondocks.
But that
Brooklyn.
But that doesn't mean they weren't there just because you couldn't see
Well,
them.
they were probably... I'm sure that they were there and were concealed because they don't want to stop Times Square from being Times Square. But that doesn't mean they're going to be able to stop something, Rob, because you can build explosive vests locally.
Sure.
And nobody's going to know. You know, I live on a street called President Street in Park Slope, Brooklyn. I live between 5th and 6th Avenue. Down at the corner of 4th Avenue and President Street, about 15 years ago, there was a group of Islamic radicals who were building bombs to bomb the entire New York City subway system, because you can reach almost every line in the New York City subway system by bombing a huge station near where I live, 15-minute walk from where I live. That was happening already in the 1990s. Remember, the first World Trade Center attack took place in 1993, the first effort to bring the building down. So nothing seems to stop these people if they're sufficiently determined. And what they need to find is willing recruits in the New York area. And now, let's go to the refugee problem for a minute.
Oh, okay.
Everybody in the community that I'm closest to the liberal progressive left,
right,
the intellectual elite, although I'm totally an outcast from that group, believe me. Nonetheless, that group has been saying that to protest against having Syrian refugees come to the United States is an act of racism. Well, that is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, because they equate actually studying what Islam really says in its holy book.
That's right.
They equate that with racism. Now, there's no way you can equate truth with racism. And the truth, the truth that's in the holy books of Islam, is taught to every Islamic school child. And what these people are implicitly saying, these people who should be the most intellectually curious people on the face of the earth, because they are the cream of the intellect of the earth. What they should be doing is following their curiosities into every nook and cranny where it leads them. But no, they censor themselves. They say certain areas are racist, and thus you cannot even think about them. So the material in the Muhammad Code, that material, I'm sure, will be regarded as racist. There's a publisher that wants the book. It's out available on Amazon.com now. If it comes out in a new version, it will take it'll take probably a year to put it together. An updated version that includes there's a subtitle for the updated version, and it's how a desert prophet brought you ISIS, Boko Haram, and Al Qaeda, and this book explains it. But nobody in the intellectual elite wants to know about this book. They regard reading anything like this book as thoroughly and completely racist, and that is a form of mental self-censorship. That is a form of mental lobotomy that I can't believe comes from a group that prides itself on its mental powers.
What is your opinion of the refugee crisis?
I think we have to be very aware of something.
Yep.
The kids who pulled off this Paris thing, not that they're kids, the mastermind was 28 years old, that's not really a kid anymore, but the people who pulled this off were not refugees. They were not people who came from someplace else. They were second generation. The mastermind of the Paris attacks grew up in Brussels. He grew up in a section that's largely Islamic. His dad owns 2 clothing stores. His dad says Europe did everything for us. Brussels did everything for us. We had a wonderful life. My son has destroyed it, he says. Now, the standard view on the intellectual left, my group, is that it's poverty that causes these discontents. And if we got rid of poverty, then we wouldn't have this kind of violence.
But is
the leftover way of thinking.
But isn't that what they're saying about the African Americans too? That they're this way because of the poor conditions that they have, the inability to get jobs, the lack of education?
Well, first of all, part of the lack of education comes directly from the kids themselves. I had 2. I was in bed for 15 years, and I have a spare bedroom, and I lent that spare bedroom out to people who would do my laundry and make sure that I had food, because I was laying in a bed. I couldn't do it myself. And I had these 2 lesbian girls living with me. They were wonderful, Rob. They were really terrific. And one of them was black, and she was very tall, very attractive, very blonde hair, quite amazing. And she complained that when she was in school, the other black kids looked at her horribly. I mean, they really loathed her for doing well in school. And they basically said, you're getting A's and B's. That's not black to get A's and B's. You're betraying your own people. And she hated that. When my wife was teaching, my first wife, in the most dangerous school in all of New York City, a school where even the principal had been stabbed by students, she came home in tears every day because the kids would not...
No, I'm sorry, Howard. They hit the wrong button. They were just going to...
We're having a wonderful technical night, aren't we?
I've never seen it this bad.
Well, that's because, no, it's not Halloween, it's Thanksgiving. We'll give thanks for the fact that we were able to have this conversation no matter how difficult the technical problems
Howard,
were.
we do have to take our news break at the bottom of the hour. Please stand by, old friend. Exonation, Howard Bloom is my special guest this hour, www.howardbloom.net. And he is the author of The Mohammed Code. It's available on Amazon.com. And everyone I know who's read that book has given it great reviews. I've read it. I love it. And thank you for sending me a copy, Howard. Howard and I will be back on the other side of this short break. Don't go away. First of all, let's start off by getting the following understood. I am not a psychic, medium, channel, intuitive, soothsayer, nor the practitioner of any art of divination. I am a Canadian, a broadcaster, a journalist, a publisher, and a realist. I tried warning people about the refugee problem with on-air commentaries and videos that I had produced, but no one listened. I was called a racist, and every name under the sun. Well, look what happened in Paris on Friday the 13th, 2015. The X Zone was the first media outlet to openly make the Friday 13th connection and was the first media outlet to broadcast the fact that ISIS had claimed responsibility for the terror in the attacks on Paris. This is war. I hate to say it, but it is going to get worse before it gets better. My heart and prayers are with those who have lost family, friends, and countrymen and women in this war that ISIS has openly declared, again, against the Western world. The time for talking is over. We must support France and other free countries against Islam. We must close our borders to Syrian refugees. Again, we need to give refugees a safe zone in Syria by a military coalition where they can live and be protected and supported by the United Nations until the time comes when ISIS and their supporters and sympathizers have been wiped off the face of this earth, at which time the refugees from Syria can return to their homeland. The military and intelligence services must be given all the resources they need to fight this fight. It is time we stopped turning the other cheek and started fighting fire with fire. This is no time to be over-politically correct. For the X-Zone radio and TV show and the X-Chronicles newspaper, I am Rob McConnell.
I am Dr. Carl O'Helvey, founder, president of a new cancer foundation focusing on evidence-based physical, mental, and spiritual interventions, including natural cancer cures, prayer, meditation, affirmations, nutrition, and other related holistic cancer prevention and cure modalities. These are used in cancer education, research, and financing care. I ask for your help to continue this important work by donating at www.holisticcancerfoundation.com.
You're listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. Radio's authority on the world of the paranormal and the science of parapsychology, celebrating 25 years of broadcasting. Broadcasting around the world and to the great beyond.
Exonation, Howard Bloom is my special guest, www.howardbloom.net. And over the commercial break, I was inundated by astrologers who sent me messages, Howard, and they said that Mercury is in retrograde. That is what is causing all the technical interference.
Aha! So it's Mercury, not Islamic terrorists.
What can I say,
let's go back to the subject of refugees for a second. Okay, the 28-year-old mastermind behind the Paris bombings was Abdul Hamid Aboud. And he was born in Brussels. And his father, as I said, owns two clothing stores. And his father says, why in the name of God would he want to kill innocent Belgians? Our family owes everything to this country. We had a wonderful life. Yes, even a fantastic life here. What's the implication of this, Rob? It's that the problem is not the refugees. These are humans just like you and me, and you and I would be panicked and terrified and trying to get away from having our homes obliterated and our children chopped into pieces if we possibly could too. The problem is not the refugees, it's their children. And why is the problem the children? Because a tiny percent will turn back to their roots. And in turning back to their roots, they will find militant Islam. Why? Because Muhammad himself was a terrorist. Muhammad himself commanded 65 military campaigns, personally led 27 of them, conquered 317 square miles of territory a day, and did it by being violent, merciless, and beheading people and taking their women as sex slaves in exactly the manner that you're seeing ISIS do it now. No matter what people tell you, the form of Islam that ISIS is practicing is not a perversion of Islam. It is the most sincere, realistic form of Islam there is, because Islam is premised on the idea that God left a message for mankind of his truth, and he left it in two things. He left it in the words of Muhammad, and he left it in the deeds of Muhammad. And the only way to be pure, righteous, and just is to follow in the footsteps of Muhammad. And as an al-Qaeda support group said in the United States just before 9/11, Muhammad killed all of the citizens, 700 to 900 male citizens of just one town. He annihilated them. What then are we to say? That Muhammad was a terrorist? No. Muhammad's example is the example of righteousness and justness, according well, this is according to militant Islam, extremist Islam. But extremist Islam is the purest form of Islam. And in every culture, there are kids who will go back to their roots. Unfortunately, if you go back to your roots in Christianity, you find a guy who said, turn the other cheek. If you go back to your roots in Islam, you find a guy who said, lay in wait for the non-believers with every stratagem of war and cut off their heads and smite off their fingertips, mutilate their bodies. That's a famous passage in the Quran. It's not in any of the subsidiary works. It's in the main work of Islamic history. It also says in that book, I'm Jewish, I'm a Zionist, why should I care about this? It also says that Jews are the sons of pigs and monkeys. And then in a book called the Hadith are the collected eyewitness accounts of everything Muhammad ever did or said. It says over and over again in the Hadith, and the day of judgment shall not come until every stone and tree shall stand up and say, there is a Jew behind me, kill him. This is real Islam. The people you know and I know in the Islamic world do not believe in it. They are not even aware of it. But folks in ISIS quote these lines from the holy books, from the Quran, and from the Hadith. At the beginning of every article they write in Dabiq, there is a quotation from the holy books of Islam. There is a quotation in one of the articles. There's a cover story in one of the issues. I think it's issue 6 of Dabiq, the magazine that ISIS puts out. There is a story glorifying the fact that we, ISIS, are now taking sex slaves. This means we've really gone back to the purest form of Islam. And it starts out with quotes from the Hadith, because the entire 8th chapter of the Quran is called the booty, the loot, the spoils of war.
Right.
And it lays out how to divide up the property of the people you've just killed and beheaded, and how to divide up their wives, their nieces, their daughters as sex slaves. And it says, and you can sell them in the marketplace, which is exactly what ISIS has been doing. So we have to recognize that in something I was writing the other day, I said, I can't remember, that ISIS is the Ebola of worldviews. It is the Ebola of worldviews. Real Islam, core Islam, root Islam, is a curse. It is a curse upon the face of the planet, because Muhammad in 622 A.D. invented jihad, or to put it differently, God gave him the gift of jihad. That's when he started making war on a regular basis and beheading people all over the place. And in 628 A.D., God came to Muhammad and gave him something else. He laid out the scroll of the earth and said, all that is to the east shall be yours, and all that is to the west shall be yours. And Muhammad sent out his letters to the emperors, the letters to the rulers of the 6 biggest territories he knew of. The Persian emperor, the emperor of what he regarded as Rome, Constantinople in those days, was the new Rome, the Nagus of Egypt, and a bunch of others. And he basically invited them to Islam. He said, I invite you to this religion, and he said some good things about his religion, and then he implied that if you don't take up my invitation, I'll be forced to use other means. What we in the West do not know, because we do not study legitimate Islamic history, we study a jerry-rigged form of Islamic history designed to make Islam look peaceful. Well, in the 150 years after Muhammad's death, the most improbable thing in the world happened. When Chosroes, the emperor of Persia, got his letter from Muhammad, he turned to his advisors, experts on international affairs, and he said, who is this from and what people is he part of? And they said, Your Majesty, you don't even worry about them. They're a desert tribe as insignificant as fleas. You will never hear from them again. Those advisors were dead wrong, because Islam toppled every superpower in its vicinity. Islam went on a rampage of conquest. And Islam, which went on an imperialist rage of conquest, conquered a territory 13,500 square miles across in 100 to 150 years of Muhammad's death. It was a territory 11 times the size of the conquest of Alexander the Great, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire, and 7 times the size of the United States. Now remember, we in the West are taught that the Roman Empire was the biggest empire in history. No, this was 5 times. It was the size of 5 Roman empires, the Islamic Empire. And I've said this before on the show, too. Carolyn Elkin, who bills herself as the world's leading historian on imperialism, says no empire in the history of the world has ever been able to conquer the hearts and minds of the people that it took over. And she is dead wrong because she apparently knows nothing about Islamic history whatsoever, which means her claim to being the leading expert on imperialism is dead wrong. She doesn't even know about the biggest imperialist enterprise in the history of the world. Because today, if you go to people who live on the shores of the Atlantic over in Algeria and ask them what their religion is, it's Islam. If you ask people in Aceh, Indonesia, or Malaysia what their religion is, it's Islam. That's a 13,500-mile square swath of territory, or that's a 13,500-mile across swath of territory. It's unlike anything the world has ever seen. If the Brits thought that they had a great empire when they said the sun never set on the British Empire, it was a pygmy compared to the empire of Islam. And what ISIS is trying to do is revive that incredible tradition and take it to the next level, meaning taking the United States, taking Canada, taking Mexico, taking South America, because God has given them that. He gave them that in 628 AD when he unrolled the scroll of the earth and said to Muhammad, all that is to the east shall be yours and all that is to the west shall be yours. And if you and I were Muslim kids today, and we were idealists and we really wanted to save the world, I mean, you and I still want to save the world. That's why you made that editorial that you played a few minutes ago. We're very serious about saving the world. But if we were living in a Muslim context and wanted to save the world, we'd be doing exactly what the ISIS kids are doing. We'd be bombing Washington and bombing New York. Why? Because there are 315 million people in the United States, all of whom are going to go to hell unless we can reach them with the message of Islam. All of whom are going to go to hell unless we get rid of that monstrous constitution that was invented by men and replace it with laws given by God himself. After all, God made the earth out of a clot of mud. He made you and me out of a clot of blood. Surely we should be living according to the laws of God. And God gave those laws, word for word, to Muhammad, the only true prophet. And if we want people to go to heaven instead of hell, hey, it's worth it to kill 15 million Americans in a nuclear attack in order to save the souls of the other 300 million, isn't it? That's the way ISIS thinks. And it's worth it to blow yourself up with a suicide vest. Why? Because life on earth is painful. Life on earth is short. But paradise is forever. And in paradise, you get 72 virgins, which you certainly are not going to get here on earth. And you go directly, everybody else has to wonder whether they're going to make it to paradise or whether they're going to end up in hell, which is a horrid, monstrous place. But if you blow yourself up with a suicide vest, that's a guarantee. And killing unbelievers, that is a guaranteed express ticket to paradise.
I've got to ask you a question, Howard. Like you and I are old friends. Why would anyone want 72 virgins?
Oh, my God. Oh, Lord. Well, let's see. Richard Dawkins would answer that by saying your selfish genes want wombs in which to make copies of themselves. Of course, we have other pleasures that we think of when we think of 72 virgins. But remember, Muhammad said in one of the hadith, get thee a young girl, that thee may play with her. And he meant it. He married a 9-year-old girl. This is why the people of ISIS think nothing of taking children who are 9, 10, 11 years old and raping them. Because Muhammad did it, hence it's holy. Period.
What would happen, Howard, if a group of very high members of Islam were to try and rewrite the Quran, taking out all the negativity and bringing the Quran up to date?
It would be considered one of the most unholy acts, one of the most satanic acts on the face of planet Earth. Because according to Islam, especially extremist Islam, according to Islam, God sent between 120 and 12,224 prophets to Earth. And every single one of them had the exact message of God himself. And every single one of those prophets screwed up. Moses gave the exact words of God to the Jewish people, and the Jewish people kept adapting and changing it to adapt it to its times. And in the process, they turned it from a book of holy stuff into a book of demonic stuff, according to the way that Muslim militants look at this. And then God gave that exact word, his exact truth, complete with Sharia, to Jesus, because he was another prophet. And the Christians did exactly what the Jews had done. They screwed it all up by reinterpreting it. And the only people who have ever stayed faithful, loyal, and true to the Word of God itself, who've ever kept their eyes glued to 622 AD, when Muhammad made his hijrah, who've ever stayed true to the exact example that Muhammad left in his life, the only people who've been faithful to God himself, are the Muslims, and particularly the Muslims of ISIS.
Well, how do we know?
That's the way they look at it.
So how do they know for a fact that Muhammad really received this information from God and that Muhammad wasn't a delusional psychopath who was hearing voices in his head?
Well, look what happened to Salman Rushdie when he wrote a novel that implied that maybe Muhammad was just a human being,
Yeah.
and maybe he was a delusional psychopath, and maybe he was writing his delusions down, right?
Right.
Well, remember what happened to Salman Rushdie?
No.
The Pakistanis rioted against him. They have a tendency to riot about things like this. They're also the people who rioted against the Danish cartoons. And the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was busy founding modern Iran, the country that we in the United States have just made a big nuclear deal with, the Ayatollah put a price of, I believe it was $5 million on Salman Rushdie's head, and Salman Rushdie had to go into, this brilliant novelist, who comes from a Muslim background, had to go into hiding for the next 10 to 15 years.
Wow.
So that's what happens when you try to imply this. Whole groups of people, the kinds of people who just hacked a secular blogger to death, can you imagine what they would have done to him if he had said what you just said?
But
They would have tortured him first.
How come they have rights and we don't?
Because you and I are not living... Okay, here's how Osama bin Laden put it. Osama bin Laden was essentially my teacher. In the 1990s, I started collecting every word Osama bin Laden ever wrote down.
Really?
Or ever broadcast, yes. And I have 180 pages of it in the computer.
Wow.
That's how I got into... That's how I ended up writing the Muhammad Code. I ended up writing the Muhammad Code, Rob, because I read all those 180 pages over and over again, and I realized that Osama bin Laden was a great scholar, that he really knew his stuff. He really knew his history. The problem was, I'm not a bad scholar either, and I tend to really know my history, and yet I didn't recognize a single one of the names that he was throwing around. I didn't even know which names were place names and which names were the names of people. So I became determined to crack the Osama Code, to crack the Muhammad Code. And I finally found the four basic documents of Islam, and those four basic documents are the Quran, the Hadith, and the two surahs, the very first biographies written by Muslims about Muhammad in the early days of the Islamic Empire. They're one by Ibn Ishaq, which is about 600 pages long, and one by Al-Tabari that's 31 volumes long. And it was the mother lode. And that's the material from which I gave you the Muhammad Code. All of these books are arranged like jigsaw puzzle pieces. They're totally confusing. But if you put them in chronological order and extract the story they tell, you're extracting the story that every Muslim school child is expected to know. And that story is bloody, grim, and violent. One of Muhammad's neighbors, when Muhammad won a battle against the Meccans, he grew up in Mecca. These were his neighbors. He had fled from Mecca because he was afraid the Meccans were out to kill him. They thought he was going to destroy their tourist industry, all the people coming to see that big black meteoric stone, the Kaaba, once a year. And Muhammad fled to another town. And then the Meccans, and he, in order to pay the people he was living with, because he was living with the people of that town, and, house guests are unwelcome after a very short amount of time. So to repay his hosts, he started raiding the camel caravans that went from Mecca to Syria. And eventually the Meccans got fed up with this. They called him the highway robber. So they got their army together, and they marched on Medina, the town in which Muhammad was, and they expected to win. And you would have expected them to win, too. These are seasoned warriors up against a guy who hadn't really made war before. And Muhammad won. And when he won, he killed an awful lot of the most senior members of the town he'd grown up in, the most highly respected people in the town he'd grown up in. And what did he do with their bodies? Did he treat them with respect? No, he threw them down a well to show his contempt. Meanwhile, he had some prisoners. And one of those prisoners had been a neighbor of Muhammad's. And the prisoner came to Muhammad and said, Muhammad, please, you know I have a family. You know I have kids. You know what would happen to them if anything happened to me. Please do not behead me. Muhammad did not even look the man in the eye. Muhammad didn't even glance at his face. Muhammad simply said, looking off into the distance to one of his associates, strike off his head. That was the kind of compassion that Muhammad showed. And since you are expected to live a life that imitates the life of Muhammad, That's the kind of compassion you're expected to show. None. Absolutely none.
One quick question.
And all of that story is in the Muhammad Code. Go ahead.
One quick question before we have to say so long for tonight. Do the Muslims ever make derogatory comments against Christ? And how come they haven't attacked the Vatican yet?
Well, first of all, the Hadith say that Rome is on the target list. So Rome's been on the target list for close to 1,400 years now, and they have said over and over again that they're going to attack Rome. But when they say they're going to attack Rome, Rob, they don't mean the city.
Right.
They mean the entire Roman Empire. That is, they mean all of Europe. So, yes, Rome is on their target list, the city is on their target list, but Europe is on their target list. And they feel that they once ruled Europe, and it's time for them to rule Europe again. And they kept Europe in line through a reign of terror. And there are some Muslims who are preaching that reign of terror come back. Do they ever say derogatory things about Jesus? Well, they say that Jesus was a prophet. And that meant that Jesus gave us the exact words of the Quran, because that's the only truth, is the exact words of the Quran, that God has been trying to get through to us over and over again. They say that Jesus, we're not going to be saved through Jesus dying on the cross. Jesus was here to announce the coming of Muhammad. Now, if some people, some Christians that I know would find that sacrilegious. In fact, some people would find it highly offensive. But that is the belief. And in fact, on one of my appearances on Iranian television, I was on with a producer in Tehran who had made a film that they said had won awards in Italy on the life of Jesus. And what did it basically say? What I just told you, that Jesus came here and delivered the exact words, word for word, of the Quran, that we've all screwed it up, and that Jesus was here to announce the coming of Muhammad. And when the day of judgment comes, Jesus will stand at the right side of Muhammad.
Wow.
Or the right side of God.
Howard, as always, time with you goes by so fast, my friend. I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight, Howard. It's always a great pleasure talking to you. Makes me feel
Thanks,
like I'm
Rob.
at home. Hey, listen, you take care of yourself, my good friend, and please be safe. I worry
I'll
about
talk
you in
to
the
you soon,
beginning.
Rob.
All right, take care of yourself,
Okay.
Howard. Bye-bye now. XO Nation, Howard Bloom has been my guest, www.howardbloom.net. Well, that's it for tonight. For some of our stations, for the rest of the network, please stand by. I will be back on the other side of this break with the news as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. I don't know, send me your email, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. I'm always interested to hear what you people think. Am I right or am I wrong about the refugee situation? I don't want them here. I really don't. Tell me what you think. I'll be back on the other side of the news. Don't go away.